what I'm saying here is that the terms we use are wrong. A conflict is between two sides, right? And the sides are roughly symmetrical, and they disagree about something. And the way you resolve a conflict is the sides get together, they negotiate, you come to some kind of a compromise, and you resolved it. Well, that's not what's happening here. This is instead an instance of settler colonialism, just like the United States is, but it's settler colonialism. In other words, it has to do with settlers, you know, the Zionist settlers of 125 years ago and so on, coming to this country with the intention of taking it over. Now, they weren't immigrants with the intention of integrating into the society. They had the intention of taking it over, and they're very clear about that. I mean, they said that very clearly. They saw this as the land of Israel, and it's all the land of Israel. It wasn't 78% of the country they were aspiring to. There was no green line. There was no occupation, and most important, there was no other side. You know, when the white settlers came to the United States or to North America and began their process of displacing and eliminating the Native Americans weren't another side. They weren't negotiating with them. They weren't, you know, settler colonialism is unilateral. That's the thing to understand here. This is a unilateral process of taking over a country. And every settler colonial movement makes up a narrative. It makes up a story of why the settlers are entitled to that land rather than the indigenous. See, and the story usually has to do with God, somehow. You know? Well, here it's easy. You know, God gave us the land. I mean, trump that. You know, and the whole story of, you know, there was a revolt against Rome, and we lost, you know, and the Jews were exiled, and now we're coming back. It's a story. It never happened. There was never an exile. There's not one reputable historian, even Israeli, that has ever written about an exile. Romans never exiled people. They sold slaves, that's true, but they never exiled peoples. And in fact, what's interesting is that almost immediately after the revolt, the country was devastated, that's true, but in the century afterwards, the country flourished. That was when you had the emergence of what's called the Jerusalem Talmud, and very, you know, famous Talmudic centers like Yavne and Sepphoris and so on, Sippori in Hebrew. So that this whole story was made up. And I can tell you the man that made it up, Ben Zion Dinur, who was one of the first Israeli Minister of Education. And they made up this story, and the point of the story is we're coming home, right, to a land that God gave us. It's our homeland exclusively. And this is the land of Israel. So that, in a sense, I'm not going to get into that whole history, but this issue of exclusivity is crucial. You know, because you have that element until today. In settler colonialism, there's no other side. In any case of settler colonialism. The indigenous are not your friends. You don't get along with them. Maybe in the first hour or two, you know, they save your life by teaching you how to grow something, and then you kill them. You know, there's no relationship between settlers and the indigenous people. And then you've got this whole issue of exclusivity, because every settler group claims an exclusive. If you recognize the indigenous as a side, or as a people with rights, or that have some kind of claim to the land, you're undercutting your own claims. Then you have to deal with them. The way you eliminate them and displace them is simply by denying them any claim, any sense of agency. So that Zionism was based on three elements that did that together. One was the Bible. When you look at the Old Testament, look at you know where ISIS came from? Read the book of Joshua sometime. It's a book of genocide. And you have genocide all through the Old Testament. So there's an exclusive, God gave us this land, period. And you have strangers. You're supposed to be nice to strangers, but they're always strangers. There's never any integration. And not only that, if they raise their heads, like in the Bible, the people of Nablus do, you kill them. I mean, there's zero tolerance. Didn't begin with Giuliani, believe me. So that's one element. The second element was ethnocracy. Israel presents itself as a democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East. You hear this every day. And it looks like a democracy. You know, if you go to Israel, most people are kind of white. You know, it has a European standard of living. Most people speak English. I mean, it looks Europeanish at least. But in fact, it's not a democracy. It's what we call an ethnocracy. An ethnocracy is when a country belongs to a particular people. And all you have to do is look at the Israeli flag, and you can see that. In other words, in this country claimed by Zionism, the whole country, from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, the flag represents one particular group with the Star of David, and that's a minority group. Because today, the Israeli Jews are a minority in this country. There already is a Palestinian majority, even before refugees return. Well, this comes out of Eastern Europe and Central Europe. You know, Germany before the end of World War II, and Russia, Poland, Hungary, until today are ethnocracies. Russia belongs to the Russians. Hungary belongs to the Hungarians. Look at the way they're treating refugees from Syria that try to come in. It's xenophobia. So Israel is basically a transposition of Eastern European tribal nationalism into the Middle East. So actually Israel is much more similar to Poland or Hungary or Russia than it is to the United States. And that's where the exclusivity comes from. Because the idea is this is our country and it belongs to us exclusively. And the third element, again, is settler colonialism that has that same element that we talked about. So you have three elements that feed into Zionism, all of which have an exclusive claim to the country, and all of which deny any claim, or the existence even, the collective existence of an indigenous people. So that then the whole process was taking over the country. And if there's one word that I would use to characterize the entire Zionist movement over the last 125 years, and it's a word we use in Israel, it's the word Judaization. It isn't a term we use very often. It doesn't have a legal reference like occupation or apartheid. But we're Judaizing the Galilee. That's an official Israeli government policy. We're Judaizing Jerusalem. And overall, the idea is our goal is to Judaize the country. In other words, the goal is to turn an Arab country into a Jewish country, to turn Palestine into the land of Israel. That's the overall goal. And what I would argue is that it's done. In other words, we talk about conquest in Zionism. Even though it belongs to us, we still conquer it. Joshua conquered as well. So it's a word that's acceptable. So we conquered the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, not with the intention of giving it back. This was the last stage of a century-long process of Judaization. And so, you see, the problem with the word occupation, I mean, I say it's not a conflict, but I also say there's no occupation. I think we shouldn't use that word, Because now it's true, it is an occupation in international law. It's certainly an occupation if you're a Palestinian. But the word occupation implies an external territory. It's outside of Israel. You have Israel proper, and then you have the occupied territory, that bifurcation. And in all the negotiations, of course, Israel's fine. We're not negotiating anything about the 78%. That's outside of negotiations. We're talking about the 22% that is so-called occupied, with the idea that somehow that's outside, that can be detached, that Israel would actually be willing to turn that into a Palestinian state. But it's not true. That was never, ever, ever the intention of Israel. In fact, Israel has never recognized the existence of a Palestinian people, let alone its collective rights. In the brightest days of Oslo, 1993, Rabin demanded of Arafat that he write a letter. And actually, he wrote a very moving letter. You should look it up. Not only recognizing the state of Israel, but recognizing it as a legitimate construct. Nothing grudging. He had to genuinely, wholeheartedly accept the idea of Israel as a Jewish state, which he did, much to Edward Said's consternation, but he did. In return, Israel did not recognize the Palestinian people and their rights. All Israel did in Oslo was to recognize the PLO as a negotiating partner. That's it. With an open-ended negotiations, it had no goal. Arafat would sometimes say we're negotiating a two-state solution. Rabin would correct him and say, no, we're not. Maybe, who knows, maybe that'll emerge. We have no idea where the negotiations are going. And that's, of course, why they failed, because, when Oslo began, there were 200,000 Israeli settlers in what's called the occupied territory. By the time it ended 7 years later, in the year 2000, there were 400,000 settlers. Today, there's almost 800,000 Israelis living in the Palestinian, what we would consider an occupied Palestinian territory. So what I'm saying is there was never any pause in the process of Judaizing the entire country. There was never a pause even. No one ever really thought about it. And what I would argue is it's done. In other words, it's finished. The process of Judaization. And I would argue that the West Bank is Judea and Samaria today. It's an integral part of Israel. There is no more Israel proper and an occupied territory to detach. And that's a problem with BDS. BDS still reflects the two-state idea. It hasn't been updated, and that's a real problem. We've always supported BDS, the boycotts, divestment, sanctions movement. But one of the elements is end the occupation, that I would argue is a diversion, because it is ended, and there never was an occupation. And the other element is equal rights for Palestinian citizens of Israel. So here you've got that Israel occupation dichotomy that we have to do away with, I think. So BDS has to be rethought and reformulated in light of a new analysis and in light of, I think, the one-state program that I want to present. So, in case you still didn't get the point, Israel imposed over the occupied territory what I call a matrix of control. In other words, in case you still didn't get it, that it's not Palestinian, it's ours, we're going to keep it, we simply created what we call facts on the ground that are so massive and so permanent that it makes Israeli control irreversible. Again, you've got about 800,000 Israelis living in these blue blotches, about 200. We talk about settlements, but that's the wrong word. You think of a settlement, you think of somewhere in Wyoming, you know, a couple huts on a hillside. But settlements in Israel are really cities. Ma'ale Adumim is about 50,000 people. Upper Modi'in here is about 80,000 people. Neve Yaakov, Pisgat Ze'ev in northern Jerusalem is 120,000 people. And they're being consolidated, these settlements, into these pink areas that Israel calls settlement blocks. So we're in the process of consolidating major urban areas that are linked into the urban areas of Israel itself, with a whole system of major highways, some of them for Israelis only. One of them that was just opened a couple of weeks ago with a wall down the middle, where Palestinians drive on one side and Israelis drive on the other side, that again incorporate this into Israel. The Palestinians, I mean, maybe I'm talking to an audience that knows, so bear with me if I'm repeating, but the Palestinians are then confined, about 95% of them, to areas A and B, and Gaza, which is a cage. Well, areas A and B in Gaza represent 40% of the occupied territory. So let's put it in this kind of a perspective. The occupied territory is an area about the size of Rhode Island, not the biggest state in the Union. And the Palestinians are confined to 40% of Rhode Island. Okay? And then areas A, B in Gaza are shattered into about 164 separate islands. You know, it isn't like 40% as one block. There's 164 islands, all surrounded by settlements, highways, checkpoints, the wall, and so on. So think of Rhode Island, where you have a population of about 5 million people stuck in 164 islands on 40% of Rhode Island, and you begin to get an understanding of how unviable and how far we are from any possibility of a two-state solution. I mean, it's simply gone, and long gone. And I think we should stop talking about it. Because the more you keep talking about an irrelevant solution, you're simply muddying the waters. And let me say, it's just cute, because we get American news in Israel that you don't really get. It's a different perspective. You know, in 2014, the Obama administration sent Kerry here, the Secretary of State John Kerry, not here, to Israel, Palestine, to try a last-ditch effort to salvage the two-state solution. And they really tried. I mean, it was genuine. In one of his visits, Kerry came with 320 advisors. Now, what you do with 320 advisors, I have no idea. And it failed. And the chief negotiator was Martin Indyk, who was the head of AIPAC. And he said it's because of Israel that it failed. That's the degree to which it was clear. But this is what I want to get at. Let's end this talk of a two-state solution. And the best term to end it, the most definitive, was Kerry's. So Kerry, after this whole thing collapses, is testifying in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And he says, and I'm almost quoting, look it up on the internet, fact check me. He's saying to the senators, well, you know, so we're sitting down and we've started to finalize an agenda and the issues, the final status issues, and all of a sudden Israel announces the building of 5,000 housing units in the West Bank. And poof, poof. That's what Kerry said, poof. Now there's no post-poof. Poof is it. There's nothing after poof. And the good part about poof as well is that it clears the air. Poof. Now finally we can dispel this fog of a two-state solution that was always getting in the way. Every time you wanted to think of another way to go, the two-state solution would get in the way. Poof, it's gone. Now we can begin to see clearly. And that's what I want to focus on tonight. So, the two-state solution is not only gone, but it never was. And even if you think it was, it's gone. Which means then, not only is the two-state solution gone, but Israel, and this is really important, the framing, because one of the ways Israel gets away with this is that Israel presents itself as the victim. We're the victim, always, you see. We might be the sixth largest arms exporter and occupying power for 50 years, but we're the victim. So the framing is important. We have to say Israel eliminated the two-state solution. It wasn't the Palestinians. Abu Mazen would sign on it tomorrow morning if he could. Which means then that it's Israel that has de facto already created a single state. There is one state today. The whole argument, two states, one state, is over. There's one functional de facto country between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. You can't get into this country without going through Israeli border controls. There's one effective government here. Don't tell me it's the PA. There's one army, obviously. There's one currency. There's one infrastructure. By any measure, this is already one country, right? And it's an apartheid country. It's an apartheid state. Because is one country ruled by one governing power that has three separate legal regimes. You have one legal regime for Israeli Jewish citizens of the country. You have a second legal regime for non-Jewish citizens of the country. And that's what this whole Jewish nationalities law was about a couple months ago. And you have a third legal system for the non-Jewish Palestinian citizens of the occupied territory. So apartheid simply means separation. That's what apart means. Separateness. You just, again, look at the Israeli flag, and you can see that one population has separated itself from the others. And then that population creates a permanent, institutionalized regime of domination. It's not Jim Crow, discrimination. You have that everywhere. It's the regime, it's the laws, it's the concept of the country, of the state. And that's an apartheid system. So I would say the two-state solution we could have lived with. Again, both the Palestinians and the Israeli peace movement accepted it. We weren't against it, but it never was, and it's gone. So the one state that exists today, which is an apartheid state, obviously is not acceptable, hopefully to any of us, which seems to me almost mathematically to leave one option still possible. And that is, and again the framing is important, to transform the single state, the apartheid state that Israel created, into a democratic state of equal rights for all its citizens. Which shouldn't be such a shocking idea for Americans. A democracy. And that's basically what we're talking about. Transforming an apartheid regime, and we can show and prove that it's an apartheid regime, into a democratic state of equal rights. So that's what we're talking about. Now, let me just go on for another couple minutes, if I may, because it's a good idea. In fact, the one state has been in the air for a long time. But what we've been trying to do over the last year and a half is to really nail down what do we mean? What would it look like? How would it function? And I'll be honest, we put a lot of work into it. Any of us could have sat down for 5 minutes and written up a plan that us leftists would love. I can do that. Me and my 5 friends, we'd have a great plan. But we said to ourselves, we want to formulate a program that we can genuinely take forward into the political arena. We want to be political actors. So we had to bite a few bullets. and we had to address all the different parties. So let me just, we have a 10-point plan that you have. Let me just very quickly talk about 4 points. I promise quickly. And our plan divides up into 2 parts. One is decolonization, because we're not talking about a conflict. So we're not talking about some technical solution. The border is here, we do a territorial swap, we move a few people around, and we have a solution. We have to decolonize the country in a fundamental way. So we have decolonization leading to a post-colonial situation. So first of all, we're talking about a single constitutional democracy. A country with a constitution that Israel doesn't have today. Israel is the only country in the world, except Britain, that has the Magna Carta, that doesn't have a constitution. And the big, I think the major revolution of what we're talking about is that this country would belong to all its citizens.